Good evening. Srebrenica. The massacre at Srebrenica, genocide if it was, in July 1995, was Europe's worst massacre since World War II. Over 8,000 men and boys murdered by the army of part of Bosnia, called Republika Srpska, or RS, or something like that. Republic of Serbia is what it stands for, not to be confused with Serbia itself. There was never any justification for killing any of them. Each death was a criminal murder, or worse. This lecture follows two Gresham lectures on Srebrenica given with Dr. Nevenka Tromp in 2015, and it's less about new evidence than I might have hoped, because the United Kingdom National Archives have been closed during COVID lockdown, and limited internet access hasn't enabled me to do as much as I would have hoped. But it may well be the documents I would have wanted under the new 20-year rule, which covers 1995, and Srebrenica. Might well be that the documents I wanted would have been withheld or blacked out or redacted in some way. So it is that most of what I'm going to say is already available publicly, with some additions. But given the enormous mass of material on Srebrenica subject, I hope to navigate a way through to give focus to one or two issues to keep in our minds until they have been fairly resolved. Of course, resolution could happen in minutes if only governments around the world would be as open with all of us as would serve the interests of the survivors and the bereaved of Srebrenica for as long as they may still live. Delaying openness until after all the bereaved and victims have died, well, maybe that will reduce the sting of disclosure for culpable governments. To reach conclusions on certain questions, it may be necessary to reset any assumptions made, for example, about governments giving priority to the interests of victims. They don't. To governments owning up to errors, they ask of the speeding driver or the more serious criminal in the national court system. Well, they don't. Or to governments producing documents where state reputations would be at risk. They don't. For lawyers and others, confronting the difficulties of proving the crime of genocide and being honest about whether it's worth trying to prove it may be unsettling. And we may have to puzzle over how the errors of one government may be covered up for by successive governments, even when they're of different political colours. We may have to wonder what a Charles Dickens alive today might have made of, or might make of, trials of people like Karadzic and Mladic lasting the decade they more or less did, despite the core evidence of their responsibility for mass killings being completely unanswerable. Maybe indeed it's time to ask whether the constraints of present judicial procedures demanded by the rule of law have gone too far. Recent history. I can neither assume familiarity with the wars in the Western Balkans that lasted most of the 1990s, nor spend time required repeating what was in the 2015 lectures. I'll hope to get enough history across quickly, even for those who may come to the topic afresh. When the 6 republics of the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, started breaking up, the Serbs living in multi-ethnic Bosnia desired, or were persuaded that they desired, to live in Serb-only communities. The composition of Bosnia, as shown by the left hand of the two images before you, was multi-ethnic and ethnically mixed. The red areas are those which had a Serb majority, the green those that had a Muslim majority, and the blue those that had a Croat majority. To make any significant part of Serbia sufficiently joined up in itself to join Serbia proper required what? Required that non-Serbs in those areas which needed to become Serb-dominated had to be killed, and the other non-Serbs had to be forced out. And some 3 years of mass murder by the Serbs achieved just that, as the second map, or the second image on the right-hand side of your screens, shows at the moment. The red areas that had become known as and ruled as Republika Srpska got a Serb majority. That process culminated more or less in what happened at Srebrenica, which you can see here on the right-hand side, one of 3 so-called safe areas protected by the United Nations. Safe area Srebrenica was protected by a lightly armed, undersized United Nations Dutch battalion known as Dutch BAT. So wicked what was soon to happen in Srebrenica that eventually the United Nations and NATO and European powers found the courage to use force and to bomb the Serbs who were attacking Sarajevo and bring everybody by force to the Dayton peace agreement table. It's worth observing, this is another picture of the same result of what had been achieved by murder. The bits in blue on this map, with Srebrenica and Sarajevo marked, are linked at the top, all but for a bit known as Brčko, which is still an internationally administered protectorate. Once those 2 bits of Republika Srpska are joined together, it will be easy for them perhaps to be allowed to join Serbia proper, thereby to join in the great family of nations, even if they had achieved homogeneity and contiguity by mass murder. Let's move to the 11th of July of this year. On that day, at this Srebrenica Potocari Memorial and Cemetery, there were 9 burials. Let's remember them. Sejad Hasanović, Alija Suljić, Hasan Pezić, Hasid Hasanović, Zudia Avdagić, Bajro Salihović, Ibrahim Zukanović, Salko Ibišević, and Kemal Music, aged between 22 and 70 when killed. But it was for some, maybe all of these 9 people, there are their names, and here are the coffins. It may be that for some or all of the 9 people, all that was buried were body parts. Why? Because having been shot, they were then buried in a mass grave. That mass grave was dug up and buried elsewhere in order to hide what had happened, dug up and reburied again, and maybe again. And indeed, it is rumored or said to me by somebody who should know that in one instance, a human being's parts were found in 5 different mass graves. Why? Because, of course, machines are no respecters of persons, which they divide up into bits and pieces as they do their work. Imagine being one of those at the ceremony, remembering by body parts someone you loved but lost and last saw 25 years ago, counting all those criminals engaged in these mass crimes, from the executioner shooter of the rifle or the machine gun to those who last deposited the body in the last mass grave. You knowing that you may walk in the street by some of those people who have been involved. Imagine trying to find internal peace or rest. At the top end of the management chain of criminality, some people, Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic for the Serbs in Bosnia, or Slobodan Milosevic for neighboring Serbia, have stood trial at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, as it is known. They each denied culpability. Milosevic, whom I prosecuted, died before his trial was concluded. Karadzic and Mladic have both received life sentences for genocide and other offences. Mladic is still under appeal, and the prosecution are appealing his case as well. Verdict may be next year. The few survivors and the thousands of bereaved may suffer a lifetime of unstoppable grief. And why should they not? But for those of us who've been interested in the tragedy, but like me, never personally involved, do we help or hinder the bereaved and victims by going over and over the mysteries that remain about Srebrenica? Or should we shut down some, at least, of those mysteries that, I repeat, and I'll mention it again, could be resolved in minutes if governments opened their archives of documents without relying on those principles of little value in human terms of sovereignty or national security? There can be no remaining national security interests in hiding what is known by many countries of what happened, and any concerns for whistleblowers could, after 25 years, be easily dealt with. But there are, I think, some issues that should not be forgotten, and they're these. First, whether genocide, which courts have found happened only in a few days in July 1995, actually started much earlier, 1993, and was continuous all the way through. Second, what part Serbia itself really played in Srebrenica and in all the other events leading up to it. And third, what part did Western powers play, wittingly or not, that may have led in the events that led to the genocide, assuming it was, in Srebrenica. Srebrenica mass murders then have been found to be genocide by individuals at the ICTY and also by the state of Serbia at the International Court of Justice that deals not with crimes by individuals, but in this particular case with breaches of the Genocide Convention by one state alleging a breach against another state. First then, did genocide, as found by these courts, and they all made the same rough finding, only last for a short time in July? Many scholars and others regard these findings as completely unrealistic because genocide is a process and doesn't happen spontaneously in just a few days. Victims and bereaved and many lawyers have argued that the genocide did start, indeed, in 1993. May they be right? May the court decisions have been in some way diluted, perhaps by political considerations, perhaps not wanting to find a state like Serbia or its leaders culpable of something so serious as genocide for a very long period of time. Or may the findings simply be wrong in the other direction. There was never a genocide. The critical finding for proof of genocide is what can be proved about the state of mind of the person or state leadership concerned, and assuming that one of the necessary acts required for proof of genocide has been proved, the question to be asked about the mental state of an individual or the mental state of a group that's running a country where you're looking at a state is, was the act done with the intention to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such? And when we look first then at the leaders of Republika Srpska, and I'll deal with this very briefly, it's possible to argue that with the conviction for genocide of Mladic and Karadzic, and with findings of persecution by other very senior state officials like Biljana Plavsic, it's possible to consider that that was really genocide. It was genocide by Republika Srpska against the Muslims of the same state of Bosnia in which they all lived. And if it comes to people asking for the two bits of Republika Srpska to be joined together and then maybe to be allowed to join Serbia itself, well, it'll be possible to shout, foul, this was achieved by genocide. It's also possible to imagine that the international community will allow it to happen in any event. But what about the leaders of Serbia itself, against whom the basic allegation, Milosevic and others, so far as we prosecuting Milosevic were concerned, the allegation against them and Serbia, which was never formally involved in any of the three wars of the 90s, Croatia, then Bosnia, then Kosovo, not actively involved, although, of course, Kosovo was a part of Serbia. What was the allegation against them? Well, the allegation was that they were not uninvolved at all, and that they were both arming, helping, advising, and even instructing the Serbs, first in Croatia and then materially the Serbs in Bosnia, what should be being done. But there are very limited court findings, apart from the very limited finding at the International Court of Justice delivered in 2007. Milosevic died before verdict. Momcilo Perisic, his chief of staff, the military chief, was acquitted of everything and never charged with a genocide offense in any event. And no other Serb, that is, no other Serbian Serb, was charged with a genocide offense. And so that's the principle, the basic allegation, but the underlying allegation was that there was a critical Serb, proper Serb, not Republika Srpska, a critical Serb project driving the Srebrenica atrocities and all earlier mass killings that had converted multi-ethnic Bosnia into a jigsaw of only 4 pieces, 2 of which might ultimately claim majorities and join Serbia. That project, known since the 19th century as Greater Serbia, sought hegemony in the Western Balkans for Serbia. The project that became a dream survived 2 world wars, and in the wars of 1990s, it was said, drove first the Serbs to kill people in Croatia and then in Bosnia. The thought there drove those people to murder their neighbors who were not Serbs, and so on. The dream became the worst of European nightmares, and the power of that dream, a continuing dangerous nightmare, must be properly understood. And only with some certainty of what drove the slaughter may we save Europe from some form of repetition. It is no surprise to be told, as I am quite regularly, that many in the Balkans have feared and presently fear more ruthless violence in support of the Serb project. Considering if and how the Greater Serbia project was influential in or determinative of all the events between 1980, when a man called Marshal Tito, who had held Yugoslavia together, died, and the time in 2008 when little Kosovo separated out from Serbia, is too big a task for now. But the spectre of the project may be sensed when considering those first 2 issues, whether genocide started in 92 or 3, and what part Serbia played in the Srebrenica background. But let's look at another kind of background, the background of the international peacekeeping intervention. Given that narratives of aggressor, victims, and peacekeepers interlock, it may be sensible to say something about that and about the failure that it was. And that connects us to the last point of the 3 I've suggested need consideration, what part the West played. Those interested in this may find of great value, as I have done, the public record of 5 sessions of a conference into international decision-making in the age of genocide held in The Hague between the 28th of June and July the 1st, 2015. This is all, by the way, indexed and hyperlinked in the printed out version or the electronic version that you can obtain after this lecture. At that gathering, 26 people from the very highest levels of the United States government, of the UN, of NATO, and of the United Kingdom government, the Dutch government, and from Bosnia, spoke openly and occasionally fiercely about issues that could be concerning or embarrassing to them. I called several of the people who were attending there as witnesses in the Milosevic trial, and I've spoken to several of them since, and in order to prepare for this lecture, and I've set out at the footnote of the printed version of the lecture who it was I spoke to, and the general topics of the conversations that have given me some kind of greater confidence in the conclusions that I reach about events with which we are concerned. In that printed document, I've set out about 2 or 2.5 sides of quotations. I'll just give you about 4 of them, because you may find they give you a flavor of the real failure that started with the deployment of something called UNPROFOR, UN Protection Force, designed to protect, as you will remember, the safe areas, one of which was Srebrenica. Right from then, up until the moment in 1995, after Srebrenica, when General Sir Rupert Smith was allowed to bomb Sarajevo and bring the Bosnian Serbs and Serbia itself to negotiations in Dayton, Ohio. So here's one quotation. Right at the beginning of the conference, it was relied on by the moderators. Rupert Smith said in a book, "The seeds for the Srebrenica disaster were sown with the decisions made in the spring of 1993. Decisions to threaten with no intention to act, to deploy forces with no intention to employ their force. Decisions made in no political context except fear of the consequences of action to the force, that is, to the home force, not to the Bosnian or Serb force. There was no strategic direction, no achievable military goals, no military campaign, no theatre-level military objectives, only incoherence." Now, Janone Walker was an interesting, very senior political advisor to Clinton, who came to office at the beginning of 1993. She makes this rather interesting point that even if, at that time, when arguably force was required, military force, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, was in favor of peace, and Clinton had just arrived, and she says, well, nobody really appreciated the importance of Clinton's being a draft dodger, a draft evader. He avoided going to Vietnam. Colin, that's Colin Powell, Colin could have told some favorite reporter that this draft-dodging president was rashly risking American lives. For those familiar with the butterfly wing-flapping incident, you can think of, perhaps, if there's truth in this, Clinton making this casual decision to avoid going to Vietnam with the consequences decades later for his impotence to require force by the soldiers of the United States, when arguably that was required. And I think just a couple more. If you look at the bottom, David Harland, a very senior UN peacekeeper, he reported President Izetbegovic as saying, "We have a choice sometimes," that's President Izetbegovic of the Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Muslims. "We have a choice sometimes between a territory and the people. Of course, both are important, but we will not allow the Bosniak people to be put into ghettos." In other words, the policy was human shields. The policy was to physically block people from trying to escape embattled areas, therefore making it harder for the enemy to attack without inflicting civilian casualties, so that by the time that Srebrenica and also the other two places, Gorazda and Žepa, had been surrounded by the Serbs, it may be that the Bosnians weren't even trying to help them escape. They were trying to keep them there as a military weapon, not a weapon, but for military purpose, keeping them there to control events. Finally, I think I'm going to turn back to Rupert Smith again at the bottom of this one. And this is the time when he had been allowed to use force. For a time, it had been taken away from him, that power, in 1995. And he said, my solution was to ring up the capitals of the troop-contributing nations and say, I'm doing this. There's a risk to hostages. Hostages were taken by the Bosnian Serbs, tied to lampposts and tied to posts and things like that. Soldiers, handcuffed. There's a risk to hostages. Are you okay with that? They said, yes, go ahead and bomb. 2 bombings later, they were not okay. That's why I called it breaking the machine. So throughout, he had been constant. You need to use force. If you deploy troops, you need to be able to use them. You don't need to suddenly change your mind and say it's too bad for the home consumption to have loss of life. If you use soldiers, they have to be used. Many more quotations that you will find. And the history from 1991 to early 1995 of the international community is one of failure. Thousands of killings were not stopped, and a formerly multi-ethnic state, content it would appear, was splitting in a way that will never be repaired. One part of the split state enjoying its level of independence by killing thousands of citizens of the other part. So, looking overall, was it genocide from 93 or just in 95? As the date of Srebrenica's fate approached, a series of well-evidenced facts can be listed. And first, those interested will want to know about a documentary made by Laura Silber and Alan Little for the BBC, produced by Brooke Lapping. It is a quite exceptional 6 and then 3 more parts, 9-part documentary with extensive face-to-face interviews with all the Balkan presidents and other leading figures in the tragedy. It should be viewed by anyone interested in learning in the most efficient way what actually happened. It's called Why Srebrenica Had to Fall, and the last part is called Why Srebrenica Had to Die and the Fall of Milosevic. Why is it so important to view it, apart from the reasons that it's important or valuable to me this evening? And I'm only going to play a couple of clips, I think. It's important not least because it was made only a few months after the events, and it got it all right. It tells an accurate story. You don't need to spend 10 years or 25 years between Srebrenica and unfolding verdicts in these cases. You don't need these long periods of time to prove what happened in conflicts. Responsible journalists and filmmakers can get there in months. These films show in grim footage the continuing pattern of mass killings from 93 until the final scenes at Srebrenica. And that continuity, shown of course in ICTY evidence, is one thing that shows genocide may well have been happening, not just in 95, but right from 93. There's the same pattern of killings for 3 years. There's no evidence change of intention by the Bosnian Serbs or Serb leaders. There's the same pattern of killings for the 3 years. And there's a record of terrible things said about the Bosnian Muslims by the Republika Srpska leaders and even some Serb leaders. If it was definitely genocide in 1995, why was it not in 1993? If not in 1993, can we find the starting point where something changes? If we can't, is that because it was constant and genocide started at the latest in 1993? And this issue is part of the prosecution's appeal in the final Mladic case, really, the final case from the Bosnian Serbs before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The first of the 2 very short clips I want to play you from Death of Yugoslavia, it's only about a minute, deals with a man called Nasser Oric, who was the Muslim military leader in Srebrenica. He'd been fighting Serbs from the enclave, but was neutralized by his own leaders, as you will see.
Sacrificed. Srebrenica was a refuge for tens of thousands of Muslims fleeing the Serbs. For 3 years, they'd been surrounded.
Ovaj narod je napačen i on želi slobodu, želi da se vrati na svoja ognjišta, želi da živi normalnim životom kako i svi ostali narodi i narodnosti živi.
Nasser Orić za grupom oficira upravo zbog pripreme naroda na takav egzodus, odnosno na operaciju koja se pripremala na Srebrenicu, bio je od strane Generalštaba pozvan za instrukcije.
The order was a trick. Once out, Srebrenica's commanders were forbidden to return. The enclave was no longer the top priority for the Bosnian government.
Mnoga primirja, mnogi politički ustupci naših državnih organa bili uslovljeni da se spasi Srebrenica i Žep.
Srebrenica was doomed. The Bosnian...
So, Srebrenica, which was to fall on the 11th with the attack beginning on the 6th and with pleas for air support on the night of the 10th. It was not deserted, it was left by the people from the Bosnian Muslim side that had been defending it. Incidentally, 2 SAS people embedded there also left earlier, consistent with their knowing what was about to come. So, jumping ahead, one of the recent interlocutors of mine, Dutch Defense Minister at the time, Joris Verhoeven, explained that on that night, the night of the 10th, before the 11th. President Izetbegovic didn't even pick up the phone to an urgent call to him from the Srebrenica mayor. Verhoeven also explains how Hasan Muratovic, the Bosnian minister for United Nations Affairs, said at a dinner that night, the 10th, words to the effect that Srebrenica didn't bother him. And may one of the truly miserable realities be that the Bosnian government side actually didn't care that much about what was going to happen to Srebrenica. More of this later. The next document, for those of you interested, that is absolutely essential viewing, is a film called Why Srebrenica Had to Fall by Dutch documentary filmmaker Huub Jasper, based on documents released for not very clear reasons by the Clinton Library. I'm going to deal in sequence with things that are revealed in that documentary and play you a couple of short excerpts from it. First, Western powers had a spy in the Serbian military headquarters, feeding out information of what was being planned. That's Serb proper, in Serbia, in Belgrade. Second, in January 94, so that's 18 months before Srebrenica happened, the lightly armed Dutch bat that was about to protect Srebrenica was promised air support by United Nations Secretary General Boutros Ghali if it was attacked. And you've probably foreseen what I'm going to reveal. The promise was broken. On the 9th of May of 1995, Rupert Smith, who at the beginning of all this had been in the Ministry of Defence in London, but was now there in theatre and in charge, he had intelligence to the effect that the Serbs were going to pick off, or the Bosnian Serbs were going to pick off the enclaves one by one and then go for Sarajevo. And you'll remember the map showing where all those things lie. Another source, the independent newspaper of the 30th of October of that very year, 95, revealed how General Bernard Janvier, commander of all the UN forces in Bosnia, made a confidential statement to the United Nations expressing a desire to ditch the enclaves, Srebrenica, Gorazde, Shepa, saying that the UN forces there were of no use, the best option was to pull out, to be pragmatic and honest, and to say he didn't feel he was betraying the spirit of his mission. That mission is based on consent of the parties. That's the warring parties, as they might be described, and in the absence of consent, leave them to face their responsibility in the zones where they are scapegoats, where we are scapegoats, he said. Janvier has been criticized as the man who made the final decision not to provide air support to Srebrenica when it could have saved, as it turns out, 8,000 and more men and boys. And he's never given a full account of whether he did, why he did, or if somebody else told him to do it. Back to the Jaspers film. By the end of May 1995, Serb heavy artillery was already close to and in striking distance of Srebrenica. On the 28th of May, the National Security Council Principals Committee, that's the top committee advising the United States President Clinton, recorded something called a quiet agreement between the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. And do you know what that agreement was going to do? It was going to suspend airstrikes for the foreseeable future, but without telling the Dutch, and of course, without telling the residents of Srebrenica. Was that the agreement that persisted right through the 6 weeks until Janvier refused air support on the morning of the 11th? On the 29th of May, a following reference to the quiet agreement.
Een dag na het besluit om de luchtaanvallen op te schorten, schrijft Nationaal Veiligheidsadviseur Anthony Lake een memo aan zijn president. Daarin benadrukt hij nog eens dat de beslissing stilgehouden dient te worden.
Privately, we will accept a pause, but make no public statement to that effect.
Verderop wijst Lake op de potentiële risico's van een terugtrekking van de VN-troepen voor de inwoners van de enclaves. Hij spreekt over
a humanitarian nightmare
Did you share his view at the time? Do you remember?
You know, honestly, you're asking me to go back, 20 years to a particular...
I'm going to race forward from those, that particular clip. You can see it in full if you pick up the references in the document. But the man you were looking at, Sandy Berger, we'll see a bit more of him later. He was the security advisor to Clinton. He knew everything about the intelligence that was coming in. He was giving advice. These are his documents. A quiet agreement with a humanitarian nightmare if and when the Dutch troops were neutralized or withdrawn.
Didn't act on that awareness.
No.
Now I'm going to look at the next clip. Is from the Death of Yugoslavia film, the BBC film. And this shows a man called Sandy Verschbauer, another senior United States spokesman. Listen to what he says, face to the camera, in 1995.
Save it.
Already in June, the fate of Srebrenica seemed pretty gloomy. We already then were considering that some kind of swap for at least the smaller of the eastern enclaves for more territory in central Bosnia might be one of the things that would be wise.
So you saw the three areas, Srebrenica, Sjepa, Gorazde, surrounded by Serbs in the east. It had already been agreed by the end of May, beginning of June, that there was going to be a swap of territories. Hand that over in some way to the Serbs, allow some other territory in the west to go to the Bosnian Muslims. But you know, it's never been described how the swap would be achieved. May it be deeply cynical that the expectation was that the Serbs would do the dirty work of tidying up the map that the international community couldn't do, and it could then get on with deciding how to resolve matters in a political way. Clear from that early date that there was to be, or was probably to be, a swap of territories. Back to the Hub Jaspers film. On the 1st of June, General Sir Rupert Smith believed that the Serbs were embarking on a campaign to capture the enclaves, and he said that, or understood, that mass flight and huge suffering were forecast. You'll find if you look at the whole film, and it's definitely worth it, that man, Sandy Berger, the security advisor, became furious when he was confronted with the documents showing what was foreseen to come from the quiet agreement. But why was he furious? It's sometimes said that in killing people, in genocidal or similar atrocities, the perpetrators come to treat the victims as dehumanized, as not human. May the same happen in the rooms of powerful advisors, because if you watch that bit of the film, it's at 17 minutes and 56 seconds, you'll come to the conclusion that Berger wasn't angry about that. He was angry about what was being revealed of what had happened in Washington. And indeed, Dutch Minister Verhoeven confirmed all of this at the July 2015 gathering in The Hague, when he explained that he'd been provided by spies, I suppose, or diplomats acting with information from spies, that it was known well in advance and therefore communicated to the West, or to the Western powers, I suppose. It was known in advance that the Serbs were going to capture the 3 enclaves in the next 3 weeks. It was all known in advance. On the 3rd of June, the first Serb military presence was noted in the safe area itself. The safe area, the area that UNPROFOR, the United Nations, was supposed to be leaving or rendering safe. Let me interpose some evidence from other sources. Andreas Zumak, of whom we will hear more later, is a much-respected, award-winning German journalist, and he saw CIA intelligence communications and spoke about them in public. He was asked about them by the Dutch government as part of their official investigation known as NIOD. The record of his second interview had to be prized out of the government by a Freedom of Information application. But this is what he said. He said, and I go down a few lines, they were listening to communications between Mladic and General Perisic, the chief of staff, you remember, from Serbia. The earliest one I saw was on June the 17th, that's 95, so there might have been earlier ones, but I can only claim that at least 3 weeks before, it was very, very clear, they had an attack force, a credible force, and they were talking in detail about what was needed, how many troops, how many weapons. I saw later in June, that there can be no doubt about it, what the intention was, and that it was imminent in the intent. So Serbia and the Republika Srpska military working together in advance, planning the taking of Srebrenica. Was Serbia involved? Of course it was. On the 12th of August 1995, Newsday published an article with this excerpt, again based on intelligence that Newsday had seen. Intelligence officials from 2 Western countries and from Bosnia said that the commander of the Yugoslav army, Perisic, was on a mountain tip across the border in Yugoslavia, sending instructions and counsel to Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb military forces. The radio conversations intercepted by intelligence services took place before, during, and after the battle for the enclave captured by the Serbs on July the 11th. Mladic and Perisic conferred constantly about their strategy and what they were doing, said one of the Western officials, who, like all such officials, desired to remain unidentified. The officer said they were analyzing the intercepts, but Mladic is always asking Perisic about what he should be doing. Perisic, Serbia proper, Mladic, Republika Srpska, giving instructions from Serbia to Mladic about how to take Srebrenica. The independent newspaper, our own independent newspaper here, between the 6th of July, recorded that between the 6th of July and the 11th, the day when Srebrenica fell, General Janvier refused pleas for support from UN forces on at least 5 occasions, and that's well evidenced in many other bits of the material you can research on the basis of the notes provided following this lecture. Huub Jasper's documentary takes up the narrative, first with a Dutch bat observation post that was seized by the Serbs on the leave or die basis. They were that confident, that powerful in comparison with the lightly armed Dutch. On the 6th of July, Mladic's troops took 30 Dutch bat soldiers hostage. On the 10th of July, between 10 and 11 p.m., there was a promise from Sarajevo, a center of command, of 30 NATO planes coming at 6 o'clock in the morning. Rather interestingly, this demand had come from, amongst others at least, Joris Verhoeven, the minister. One of the documents released by the Americans in the United States deals with this request, but in fact, it cuts out that bit, and it leaves only the bit where Verhoeven is expressing concern about the consequences of bombing for the Dutch. Verhoeven is quite clear that he made a distinct and emphatic demand for the use of air power. Why has that been redacted by the United States, this record? But Verhoeven is quite clear, and you can read in the note a bit more detail of what he says, something that was confirmed by a man, Mo Sashaba. You saw an image of him earlier, but he was the Bosnian foreign minister at the time, and he was dealing with all these people, and indeed he later appeared at the Dayton Peace Accords. Despite all the promises from 94, right the way through to the evening of the 10th, there were no airstrikes at all. On the 11th as a man called Hasan Nuhanovic reveals, at something called a Blue Sword meeting to obtain agreement for use of air power. So that's after the attack started, but still perhaps not too late to achieve something. Air power on the morning of the 11th, there was a meeting. At that meeting, there was the very top man from the United Nations, a man called Akashi. He was called to the phone to speak to President Milosevic from Serbia, who would, of course, claim, if he didn't die before the end of his trial, that he knew nothing of this. Following that phone call, the meeting was simply adjourned, and the issue of using air power then was taken no further. On the 11th, indeed, Mladic marked in. He didn't have to look up. He knew that no planes would trouble him. That same Hasan Nuhanovic, an interpreter for Dutchbat, whose mother, father, and brother were killed in the events there, was at a meeting on the 15th of July, 4 days later. General Smith, who'd been asked to stay in Korčula on holiday on the 11th, was now back with Akashi himself, Carl Bildt, and Stoltenberg, two of the negotiators for peace. Mladic and Milosevic were already there, but it was not until the next day, the 16th, that many more people of those total of 8,000 plus were finally killed. And Hasan Nuhanovic makes the point. His parents may have been among those. Here was the international community with Mladic, arms deep in blood, carrying on as normal, admitting not a thing. So very soon afterwards, what else do we know? We know that the first prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a man called Richard Goldstone, was aware of the existence of aerial photography that would show what had been happening very shortly after the 11th. Indeed, he went to America to get it. He may not even have been allowed an audience. He came back empty-handed. Now, aerial photography would have shown what was happening with the coaches taking the women out, with what was happening to the men, the mass graves that were being dug. Embarrassing, particularly embarrassing if any of the countries of the West had been in some way instrumental in allowing Srebrenica to start, by that quiet agreement or by some other agreement conveyed to Janvier, which meant that no support of the promised kind was given to either Dutchbat, but more important, to the citizens of Srebrenica. There's another source, another element, rather, of the NIOD report, that's the Dutch report, which was very interesting. In a section headed Intelligence and the War in Bosnia, there's a passage that deals with a meeting on the 3rd of August of 1995 at the White House with Carl Bildt, the Swedish negotiator, former Vice President Al Gore. This is what it says, because it's dealing with intercepts. The Dutch report says the existence of these intercepts was confirmed by a Western diplomat. During a meeting at the White House between Gore and Bildt, the Swedish negotiator tried to convince the American vice president that he should not form an excessively black and white image of President Milosevic. Gore responded to these statements by reading from American intercepts, which showed that Milosevic had consulted with Mladic about the attack on Srebrenica. Well, it may or may not surprise you to know, let me check something. It may or may not surprise you to know that on learning of that, I, of course, tried to get hold of those intercepts, and I'll explain in a minute why it was I failed. But one of the things we did do in trying to get hold of those intercepts, to check everything that was contained in that entry in the NIOD report. And so the original version of the note, I know, reads as follows. A very interesting meeting in the context was a meeting between Bildt and Gore. Bildt tried to convince the American vice president that he should not have black and white views about Milosevic. Gore responded to these remarks by starting to read from secret SIGINT intercepts, from which transpired that Milosevic had given direct orders to Mladic. In the case of Srebrenica, Gore told Bildt and X, that's the source of this information, who, by the way, is a very senior Western diplomat. We know who he is. Forget about this. But notice that line. Milosevic gave direct orders to Mladic, something you've heard before, something never available to the prosecution of Milosevic, not available to those seeking to prove that maybe the Greater Serbia project lay behind everything that was happening in Bosnia and also in Croatia. And just imagine how different it would have been if I'd had that evidence or all the other evidence of intercepts showing Perisic's involvement as Chief of Staff. Understand why we were surprised that Perisic is not only not being indicted for genocide at Srebrenica, and those of us not involved in his case, we were surprised. Imagine why we were surprised at the final verdict acquitting him of anything. A mere 6 days after the fall, so I suppose the 17th, this, my last clip, I think, from the Jaspers film, Berger, the security advisor to the president.
6 dagen na de val van de enclave schrijft de Amerikaanse nationale veiligheidsadviseur Sandy Berger dit memo.
The loss of Srebrenica and Zepa may open the way to more realistic territorial solutions, and we will need to have a heart-to-heart discussion with the Bosnians aimed at eliciting greater flexibility on the
seemed to be just too convenient. And what I saw happening in the end in Srebrenica, I've used this term, a convenient genocide.
It was real politics at its harshest.
This, sir, is less than a week after the fall of Srebrenica. Mm-hmm. Someone we interviewed describes what you wrote there as cold-blooded politics. What do you think of that qualification?
Well, I mean, I think if there was going to be a political solution at some point, it would take some kind of negotiation with respect to the ultimate shape of things. But we were not talking at that point about a political solution.
What do you think of this qualification?
I think we're over. I think I said that, right?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
There you have it. The security advisor himself cannot face the document that shows real politics at its harshest, which one might interpret as being, allow these to fall in whatever way they may, and then we can get on with the politics. I'm going to have to abbreviate what's left of this lecture in order to try and stay within the hour. You can find the detail in the printed version. But we knew, this is the prosecution of Milosevic, from other documents that were entirely certain in their content, they were stenographically recorded notes, that Milosevic had spoken with Ratko Mladic at the time of Zepa. So that's a few days, a couple of weeks after Srebrenica. We knew of the existence of intercepts. We went out to try and get them. We found a country that we knew had them. We were about to have that country before the judges to explain whether they had them or not, and if they did have them, whether they were going to hand them over. And another great power walked in and told Mrs. Del Ponte that that application had to be withdrawn. She was my boss. She simply told me to withdraw them. I had to do as I was told. I acquit myself of that decision to do nothing more in my book, Justice for All. But I think I was wrong to acquit myself. I think I should have done more, although doing more would probably have led to the end of my career in The Hague and little else. But this was the clearest interference by a great power in the investigation of the most serious possible criminality. Because, of course, if Milosevic had said, put them on a bus, give them a bottle, don't harm a hair on their head, not guilty. If he'd said, it's all right, we know there's never going to be intervention by the West because we've been tipped off, we know what's not going to happen. Go ahead and do what you like. Very guilty. And unfortunately, it didn't stop at the great power because, and you can look at this in the note, I found recently an email to the legal attaché at the British Embassy in the Netherlands, remonstrating with him over what he had said to me. I'd forgotten all about this email until quite recently. Remonstrating with him because he clearly wanted to support what was being done to stop the production of these intercepts. And I'd had to try and tell him the error of his ways. So he probably wasn't necessarily answering through the ambassadorial chain of the Foreign Office, but he was acting to someone in London, and he wanted to interfere with the conduct of proceedings. Why? Very rapidly, and you can find this in the note, something else that I need to tell you about, but I'll do it in summary, and that is that it wasn't only Western powers or Bosnia or Serbia, for example, that would want to hide the truth about what happened at Srebrenica, but surprisingly, Bosnia itself. And how can I assert that? Well, after the 2007 judgment by the International Court of Justice in the case brought by Bosnia against Serbia, which everybody, not everybody, many regarded as perhaps political and certainly unsatisfactory, after that happened, people like me and Dr. Tromp, who were asked about it, would say, well, maybe what you should try and do is try and revise it. There's a system whereby an International Court of Justice decision can be revised within a 10-year period. So you've got to get cracking, you've got to sort it out in 10 years. And so our advice was always the same, well, it'll be very difficult, but it's worth having a go, because if you don't have a go, you'll certainly fail. If you have a go, you might succeed. And in any event, you can write out the true history of what's happened in Srebrenica and Bosnia more generally, about the genocide as you believe it to be. Our advice was never taken seriously, never taken up, until the moment first of all, in 2015, we saw the Bosnian president, Bakir Izetbegovic, son of President Izetbegovic at the time of Srebrenica. He didn't seem very keen. We sent him a couple of advices on what he might do, involving the very best International Court of Justice lawyers working unpaid. Didn't even get a response to those offers of help. But then all of a sudden, at the end of 2016, we were approached out of the blue by a man called Hasan Cengic and asked to write an application for revision. We said, it's not possible. None of the work's been done. There's no evidence gathered and so on. But he was determined that we should do something, and you can read the detail of it in the note. In the end, what we realized was that I was being asked to sign a document called an application for revision, to hand it over to someone else, who would then take another document prepared by a man, an American called David Sheffer, former ambassador. And this man in the middle would merge the two documents without my ever seeing this document or ever knowing what was ultimately presented to the court. Of course, I was never going to do any such thing. But why was I being pressed? And it was real pressure being applied to me to do this. And the conclusion that was reached was that there was a determination by Serbia to put in an application that they knew would fail, and they did know it would fail for reasons that are set out in the paper, but to have my name on it because I'd been explaining for such a long period of time, very informally, very casually, that something should be done to preserve for Bosnians a proper Bosnian history of all these events. I've written to all the people involved asking for an explanation of what was happening, and a number were involved, apart from Hasan Cengic, David Sheffer, and others. And apart from David Sheffer, eventually writing when he knew I was going to give this lecture and saying this was obviously some exercise in drafting that he would not engage in. No explanation. So is our inference right? May it be right? It's a pretty strong inference to say that the government of Bosnia wanted to hide the truth itself, but then look back to that moment when Nasser Oric was pulled out. Remember what Joris Verhoeven was able to say about the reaction of President Izetbegovic and the minister on the night before Srebrenica. Do they have something to hide as well? Is that why they don't really want to use the legal system to test the truth from the Bosnian Muslim side of genocide? So let me conclude, as I must, and I don't know whether there'll be time, but you must also look at this. This is a critical thing for you to look at.
Richard Holbrooke, then US envoy, is credited as the architect of the Dayton Peace Accord. On the 10th anniversary of its signing, he said this to a Bosnian reporter.
As far as Srebrenica goes, Srebrenica is a great tragedy which should not have been permitted to occur. But it did, and I tell you that I was under initial instructions to sacrifice Srebrenica, Gorazda, and Zepa, and I felt that was wrong. And so I look forward to the day when Srebrenica is fully back in the hands of its original inhabitants, who are Muslim.
A French journalist, Sylvie Maton, emailed Mr. Holbrooke asking whether these instructions related only to the territories or both the territories and the population. He answered both.
Holbrooke, the late Holbrooke, senior negotiator, voice of the president, saying quite clearly he'd been instructed to abandon both people and place, and he put it in writing. You must watch the whole extract, the whole bit of film of which that's an extract, because he goes on to say, oh, I didn't mean to say that. Some years later, he seeks to withdraw it, and Baroness Neville Jones from Britain arguably tries to support him. You'll have to make your own judgment up. You may think those things he said have the shadow of responsibility on his face and reveal the truth. Srebrenica was abandoned by a combination of reasons leading to the failure and by an agreement not to support it. And so I'm going to come to a few conclusions, and then if there's time for questions, I'll take a few. First, there is no way we who have not suffered can know whether the unstoppable grief of which I spoke at the start can be reduced by more and better truths. But we can be quite sure of the reverse. Keeping truth from survivors and bereaved may harm by not giving them the chance to achieve a timely internal resolution, if that is in fact possible. The issue of the start date of genocide, a few days in July or earlier in 93, having been raised, must be properly answered. The only way that can be done is by Bosnia completing the process begun at the International Court of Justice case and left incomplete. In the interests of survivors and bereaved, the Bosnian state in some form must write the evidence-based history and might do so in an application to the ICJ for extensions of time limits to allow for the revision to be considered. By such an effort and application, we will also get to know what was the real role of Greater Serbia project and of whether it is still in place and still a danger. And finally, Serbia, from all the material you've heard summarized tonight and can find more in the note, Serbia, the United States, Great Britain, France, possibly Germany, and even the Bosnian government have one thing in common. They've not provided documents that would tell the truth and help survivors and bereaved spend the remainder of their natural lives in whatever peace they may achieve. They probably also share something else, the motivation for not providing documents, for hiding them. They have something to hide or some objective to serve that they would prefer not to reveal. And that takes precedence over the mere interests of victims. And they and all of them, nation states, attending Potocari memorials or wanting to be seen as ever mindful of the Srebrenica tragedy, should remind themselves of how they could do so much more good by opening up the record of their own actions and failings, but they won't, I fear. Victims have always counted for little at the hands of Republika Srpska and Serbia, and in this case, they count for little as shown by the actions of those others who have let them down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Geoffrey. That was fascinating and profoundly disturbing. Now, you have inspired some excellent questions, although we don't have a huge amount of time, but let's see how we go. First of all, in the months after World War II, the end of World War II, Tito's communists killed as many as 250,000 anti-communists. Were these massacres a modus operandi that became a precursor for massacres in Bosnia?
I don't think that can be said. Of course, the former Yugoslavia had a great deal of unhappiness during and immediately after the war, and one always has to remember that in another part of the conflict, the Croatia part, there was a history of the Croatians being part of, or being associated with the Nazis, and in their short-lived Nazi state, massacring and arguably committing genocide against Serbs and others. But I don't think you can otherwise say that one kind of killing that long ago was a precursor.
How much of an impact did Dutch intelligence failures contribute to enabling the Srebrenica genocide to occur, in your view?
I don't think I can answer with any clarity how much, whether things would have been different if the Dutch Bat itself had had better intelligence. It is quite clear from all the material that promises to use air support and to save Srebrenica and Dutch Bat were made and were not honoured. If that same intelligence had been available within the enclave, it is not clear whether Dutch Bat, by then perhaps weakened or enfeebled, would have been able to do anything itself different. What was required was the external support and assistance that had been promised, but was denied. Dutch Bat has been heavily criticised, and not for me to express a view one way or another, but I dare say viewers will just want to know that the Dutch courts have themselves made findings adverse to Dutch Bat about the killings at Srebrenica, and indeed there's an exercise underway at the moment to compensate, not in full, but to the extent of 10%, a certain range of victims of Srebrenica.
And finally, why did it take until 1995 for there to be a meaningful intervention?
I think that the record of the 2015 meeting in The Hague, which doesn't take that long to read, it's 2 days, 2 sessions each stage, and a closing session on the third morning. That will explain what happened. Smith explains it himself. There was never unity of purpose. The Allied parties, America, Britain, and all the other countries that were contributing troops, were often much more concerned about harm coming to their troops than they were about using those troops forcefully. Probably there may still be, a real anxiety about having any Muslim country in the heart of Europe, and a desire to maintain, at perhaps some unacceptable cost by our standards, a Christian state. Countries were at each other's throats. They didn't agree with each other, and that emerges from what you can find in all those records and all the other many books that have been written about this. There was no real will to use force. UNPROFOR, UN Protection Force, was a misnomer. It wasn't capable of protecting. The concept of safe areas was not a realistic concept. It should never have been used. It was muddle, confusion, self-interest, weakness. And unfortunately, the weakness can be traced to many governments, and certainly to the government here. There was no willingness to see military forces used for the purpose intended, and with the risk, however tragic and sad individually, with the risk of loss of life of those who join the armed forces and are ultimately prepared to pay the ultimate price.
I think we need to leave it there. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us for such a fascinating lecture.